Hello and welcome to Delta Sigma Pi's presentation on executing your elections. My name is Chelsea Fix and I'm an educational and leadership consultant. I'll be presenting today's session with Jasmine Flores, but with me on this call, we also have Tyler Havens, the Associate Director of Chapter Services. The Chapter Services team is excited to share some tips and best practices with you. Today, we will be covering everything you need to know for electing new officers. This presentation will be recorded for your reference and will be made available once all programs have been completed. Feel free to turn your cameras on and put your name, chapter, and email in the chat box to connect after the event. And I will let Jasmine go over the agenda.
Yeah, even if your chapter is not holding elections this term, these best practices can be used throughout the year. Today, we will be going over voting policies and procedures, election processes, nominations, speeches, software tools, and voting. After we cover these topics, you will be broken out into smaller groups and have a chance to discuss your chapter's best practices for officer elections with other brothers from different chapters. In addition to these questions we have prompted, feel free to ask any questions of each other during the small group session. We will then bring everyone back together and share ideas and follow this with a Q&A session. So please feel free to, have those questions ready for us. Also, please feel free to screenshot any of the slides to use for future reference. All right, now diving into our first topic, we're going to discuss the voting policy and procedures. In addition to national policies and bylaws, you'll also need to review your local policies and bylaws to see how many chapter members will need to participate when your election should take place and when the elections should occur. So in the meeting section of your local bylaws, the chapter's quorum should be listed. Can anyone tell me what quorum is?
The minimum number present to conduct business.
Yes, yeah, so quorum is the minimum number of members who must be present to make the proceedings of that meeting valid. Your chapter's quorum must be between 1/3 and 51% of the members of the chapter in good standing. Does anyone know what their chapter's quorum is? Please feel free to.
I think our chapter is the same at 51% is our quorum.
Anyone else?
I was gonna say the same thing. Yeah, I was just 51.
Cool. Good. And if you need to find your quorum, you're like, I don't know what my quorum is, you can find it on the dashboard of the hub. So it's all on there for your reference. And if the meeting that you host does not have quorum, does not match or exceed the quorum stated in your local documents, you will need to have a host a new meeting for these elections or any meeting proceedings. Additionally, in order to be nominated, elected, or appointed to office, with the exception of your chapter advisor, a brother must be in good standing, and any member that is placed on probation by the university or has not paid their debts to the chapter or the fraternity are automatically disqualified for chapter office. Your local bylaw should also have the terms of officers listed. I know different chapters have different terms, whether it's semester terms, academic year, calendar year. Does anybody have a little bit of everything? I'd love to hear a little from the different chapters that are on this call of what your officer terms look like.
Well, what we do for my chapter is we have president, VPF, and VPCO for a whole year, and then all the rest we do for a semester.
Yeah, I'll follow that up. We do something very similar, so we add chancellor and our senior vice president as well. But yeah, those are also all year terms, and like you said, the rest of them are semesterly. So
yeah, we at Drexel are in a quarter school. Like, we have quarters, we don't have semesters. So because of that, we keep the whole board stays on for the year, And because we have calendar year, so we usually have elections ending December and then the board starts in January.
Absolutely.
For us, we have most of our strategic positions for the whole year, and then most of the event planning for the semester positions.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for sharing. And I think with terms of office, and I do apologize. Yes, I have to say terms because we don't know if quarters, semesters, term of office, however many terms, whether it's one academic term or two, the chapter has the ability to change and, utilize what works best for them. Now I will send it back to Chelsea to discuss a little bit about our nominations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jasmine. So moving on to nominations. Once the floor for nominations has been opened, it's always beneficial to discuss responsibilities of each officer position or discuss positions the chapter is thinking about having in those chapter meetings leading up to nominations. So like if you're, for example, going to have nominations in 3 weeks, spend the next 3 weeks of chapter, if you meet every week, that is, talking about what those different officer positions look like to give everyone a clear glimpse of, what they might be running for. So to nominate an individual for an executive committee position over a video call or simply in person, say, I nominate so-and-so, for example, once the position you'd like to elect them for is brought up. Remember, self-nominations are permitted. So if you'd like to nominate yourself, go for it. And be sure to keep track of who is nominated for which position. And this can be done through a Google document, Google Sheet, an Excel sheet, Word document, or another preferred method. Also, be sure to share who is nominated with the chapter ahead of time. So it can be really beneficial to do that at least a week ahead of time, depending on when you have your meetings. If they're biweekly, do that, of course, 2 weeks ahead of times. And nominations can be shared through email, posted on Facebook, posted in the chapter's group chat, and the chapter should be notified of the date, time, and place of elections at least 10 days prior to the date of the election. So now I'm going to go into candidate speeches. So now that you have a better idea of the policy surrounding elections, you can kind of start to execute those elections. And as Jasmine said earlier, any brother in good standing can be nominated for any position. So if you're holding live speeches, while one candidate is speaking, the other should be placed into a breakout room. If the speeches have been pre-recorded, then there's no need to really do this. However, candidates should leave the Zoom call once that Q&A session with that individual candidate begins. And there should also be a set time frame for each individual speech. You don't want to have one person speaking for 10 minutes and the other person speaking for 3, if that makes sense. So this normally averages between 2 to 3 minutes per candidate, and you should allow for a short questioning period after each speech. So keep in mind that if one question's asked for one candidate, it should be asked for all candidates as well for that position. Questions should also be prepared prior to the speech, and more than 5 questions should not be necessary. Now I'm going to let Jasmine talk a little bit more about some software tools.
Yeah, there are a lot of different platforms being offered in a virtual setting, but some of the tools we've heard chapters utilizing and being successful for voting are Member Planet, WebEx, Google Forms, Zoom polls, Socrative, and Direct Poll. It is important to note that whatever platform you utilize, it must be anonymous. You should not be able to see who or how many people voted for one individual. So if you use any of these platforms, do not share the results to the rest of the chapter once you see the results, or whoever is managing whichever platform, they should simply just announce the winner. Also, whatever space you utilize to conduct ritual in a virtual meeting, so whatever you guys utilize for your chapter meetings, can be used for elections as well. So whether you use Zoom or what's the other one? Microsoft Teams, whatever you utilize can be used for voting. So to talk a little bit more about voting, Chelsea, back to you.
Awesome, thanks. So once the voting process takes place, the first set of officers, like once you're ready to start that voting process, the first set of officers to be elected, of course, are those in order of succession. You know, you've got the president, SVP, VPE, VP Finance, Vice President of Chapter Operations, Chancellor, Vice President of Professional Activities, Vice President of Community Service, Scholarship and Awards, Alumni Relations, and your chapter advisor in that order. Like I said, this is the order of succession, so you do have to follow that when you're doing your elections. And the chapter can also choose to elect other officers and chair positions during this time, but they should come after those nationally recognized officers. Names and addresses of all officers must be reported to the central office within 7 days of their election or appointment. And keep in mind, only the officers listed in the hub will receive notifications from the central office. So once the voting for chapter officers takes place, the member receiving a majority of the total votes cast for the office in question should be declared elected at that point. All right, now we're gonna move into breakout rooms. So we're gonna break everyone out into smaller groups to kind of discuss some of the questions that are shown here. How is your chapter planning to conduct voting? What platform are you using to count votes? What platform are you planning to use? And what's your biggest concern with the upcoming elections? So feel free to take a picture of this slide to remind yourself of kind of what we're reviewing right now. And so that way we can talk about everything effectively. So cool. Feel free to go into your breakout rooms now. Thank you all so much.
Quick question. Will we have time for questions at the end?
Yes, we definitely will.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you, Adam. All right. So now would be a perfect time for you all to kind of share what you learned, share what you talked about in your breakout room. Were there any really cool ideas that you heard or anything that you'd just like to talk about?
Something interesting that I heard, some tips is to keep the discussions about things that aren't relevant to a minimum. Like things like whether this person is nice or they're like helping you out a lot and that sort of thing, to keep the conversation tangible on where the officer, like the actual duties of the officer, or whether they're capable and that sort of thing, and not more on the personality of the person.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Or do we want to talk about this a little further? Or that was a really great point, though. Thank you for sharing again.
I know we had two groups, so probably two different conversations. But if there's anything that you believe the other group should be aware of, again, please feel free to share. We could just go through the three questions.
I think at least in my breakout room, we all had different voting methods and it worked for each chapter. None of the chapters really seemed to be struggling with their voting method because it was already implemented correctly.
All right, so the first question, so how is your chapter planning to conduct voting? I don't know, Adam, if you'd like to start, and then anyone after you, please feel free.
I guess I can start. So basically what we do for voting, and we do the similar thing for pledge voting as well. I create Google Forms for each position, like who would be the best president, VPCO, so on. and then I add the people who are nominated into the Google form as like options for an answer. And then I send the forms over to our VPCO, who, while we're in the Zoom meeting, after all the speeches have been done for that certain position, she then posts the link to the Google form. Then people vote on the Google form, and then we get the results.
So going off of that real quick, just a thought I kind of thought of. So do you guys do any updates within, like, let's say I was running for president, VPCO, and VPSA. If I were to get, president, that position, would I still be listed as a nominee within the other forms? Do you guys do anything with that, or just send out that form?
Oh no, once the forms have so like we basically do the forms live. So like the form for president goes out like right after the discussion for president. And then once someone is elected to a position, they're taken off of all the other positions.
My question is, how long would you leave that form open? Do people get a minute to vote, 10 seconds to click as quickly as they could? What's the best practice?
Usually we do about 30 seconds, but we usually just wait for everyone to vote. It doesn't usually take too long. Like, it's not like we're sitting there waiting for like half an hour for everyone to vote on like one person. It's usually like no longer than like a minute.
Yeah, definitely think 45 seconds to a minute would be sufficient. Like, if you really think about it, that would be very long. But if you see, you have 50 people in the chapter, you see 50 votes, I would think it'd be okay. Okay, this vote is done, and close the form.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you for your insight. Would anybody else like to share your plans for conducting voting? All right, let's go to the next question then. So what platform are you planning to use to count votes?
For our chapter, we use a website called SurveyMonkey, and that's what we've been using for a long time. Basically, it sends out like this little form, like you'd think, like a Google form and that sort of thing. And it has 10 pages, so you can do 10 different questions. So like every officer would have their own kind of page. So you'd vote on that, then click next, and then we discuss a different officer. And then, when the voting would occur, we'd like tell people, go ahead and vote, and then they would vote.
We use the Zoom polling feature, and we just make it on the spot and then launch the poll right after the discussion. And our only trouble has been brothers that log on together if they're roommates. But for that meeting, we just require that you log on from separate devices.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thing to think about, of especially knowing your chapter, and if there's roommates that obviously live together, being aware of that. Thank you for bringing that up, Adam. Now, I guess going to the last question, and this could kind of go into our Q&A. What are your biggest concerns with the upcoming elections that your chapter might be hosting?
May I ask, kind of piggybacking off the last response? So you've got an administrator, he's typing up or she is typing up the polling on the Zoom. People are clicking away. There's some responses coming in. How does that get communicated with the chapter? How do you know that's the actual truth and there's no funny business going on behind the scenes?
I think for us, we always have two co-hosts, or one host and one co-host. That way there's always two people having that accountability. And it's that mutual understanding. And we also don't have very many competitive elections, but I think to mitigate that concern, maybe even having the DD or advisor as a co-host during that meeting so that they could see would be beneficial.
Any other concerns that we have? Or just any questions that you'd like to ask maybe other officers or you'd like to ask us?
So like I previously said, we don't have very many contested positions. So is there anything against voting by acclamation for certain positions?
The answer is no. There's nothing wrong with voting. Just like, okay, we want this person to take on this role. But I guess kind of going off of that, other brothers within this call, like what do you all do to encourage or just increase participation for running of positions? Is there anything that anybody else does to increase participation?
What my chapter has been doing now is we have taken like all the EC members. We're like, okay, reach out to at least two or three people who you think would be really great, like replacements, or you think would be really great in the position. And like, so we just have them reach out to those people, like, and talk to them about it, see if they're interested, try and if they are interested, maybe set up a Zoom meeting with them and talk to them about the position, give them a little bit of a rundown of like some of the responsibilities and like really try to like make the position sound like something they would want to take on. Like, so basically have them kind of do a shadowing of a sense.
So shadowing, does anyone else have anything like shadowing, or is there anything else that you do to promote officer motivation or people running for officer positions? I feel like shadowing is one of the key things that I've heard. Go for it. Sorry.
We also have a shadowing program, and it's underutilized in all honesty, and that's something that we're working on. It's sometimes pulling teeth to get people to shadow, and we're really looking at what does it mean to shadow? How do we meaningfully engage brothers in that process? What standards are there? Is that when the transition binder is shared, or is it shared after the election? So those are some things that we're flushing out, but I think the shadowing process is truly important to allow brothers the opportunity to explore the position before running for it and see a life in the day of an officer.
I will add real quick. I know we're kind of like talking about transitions, but a little bit beyond that. I've heard of chapters that ask brothers to, help plan an event or host a professional event or community service event, fundraising. Like, I think that's also a great opportunity to be like, I'm the officer, but that doesn't mean I'm the only one that can plan events. So offering that opportunity up to the chapter, whether that's helping with committees, if you have committees within your chapter, other opportunities.
When do y'all typically do elections? I'm curious because I know some chapters I've heard of them doing them in March and others is April, right before they hit graduation. What does that look like for your chapters?
We're actually doing ours kind of mid-April. So I believe our nominations are on the 13th and our elections are on the 20th.
For us, we have our elections on April 13th, which is our second to last chapter meeting. Because usually we do our last chapter meeting, we do a senior send-off and before we do elections. We actually started nominations this chapter meeting, or like yesterday, because that's where our chapter meeting is. And basically nominations go on for until the election date. Like you can nominate yourself or like kind of like the whole process. And then on the 13th, we have our elections.
So we'll plug in to this meeting. We do have an upcoming webinar not later in March, a couple of days into April for transition meetings. If you guys also want to register for that event. So it will be April 8th, 2021, 9 p.m. Eastern time.
What can you share with us about how voting and elections will be at virtual GCC?
I think they're all smiling and waiting for me to chime in on this one. That is yet to be determined. We are utilizing and looking at a number of different systems. We utilized a voting system at each of the provincial councils with mixed results. We continue to work with that company, to continue to refine the process for our needs for Congress. And even though we don't always know what our needs are going to be for Congress, that I think that's part of the challenge is that we're still, the Congress schedule has not been set yet, so we don't necessarily know what our needs are going to be. So I can't really tell you anything other than we're still working on it.
Well, then props to all these collegiate chapters and you guys who have shared such good ideas. You got it going on better than the grand chapter.
All right. So I think now is definitely the perfect time to wrap this up. Before we do, are there any additional questions that y'all have? Okay, wonderful. So here are a few different resources on the last slide that you can find on the website to help you with your chapter's upcoming elections. And like I said, this kind of concludes the Executing Your Elections presentation. And if anyone has any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the hub or consultants at dsp.org, and we'd be happy to assist you in whatever way we can. So thank you all so much again for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful night.